There are moments in cultural history that act as fault lines, seismic events that violently tear the landscape apart, ensuring nothing that comes after can ever be the same. The late 1960s was a landscape already trembling with change, but most of its musical soundtrack, for all its revolutionary fervor, was still rooted in the familiar soil of the blues, of folk, of rock and roll. And then, from a damp basement in London, a sound emerged. It was not a tremor. It was the sundering of the earth itself. It was a sound of immense, terrifying beauty, of structured chaos, of dystopian prophecy sung by a choir boy in the court of a mad king. This is the story of that sound. But it is not the story you think you know. It is the story of the impossible year, 1969, and the near-mythical birth of King Crimson, seen not through the lens of what they became, but through the bewildering, brilliant, and ultimately heartbreaking reality of what they were for one brief incandescent moment. This is the story of the ghosts in the machine. Before we descend into that glorious maelstrom, if you believe that music is more than just background noise, that it is a vital art form worthy of deep exploration, then you have found your sanctuary here at Psych Prog. Please take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel, click that like button to help us conjure the algorithms, and most importantly, share this exploration with anyone you know who craves music that challenges, inspires, and endures. Your support is the lifeblood that allows us to unearth these crucial stories. Now, let us begin. To truly understand the cataclysm of King Crimson, one must first appreciate the profound absurdity of what came immediately before. In 1968, the world was gifted a record titled The Cheerful Insanity of Giles, Giles, and Fripp. Listening to it today is an exercise in cognitive dissonance. It is a whimsical, eccentric, and deeply English collection of quirky pop vignettes, spoken-word interludes about a character named Rodney, and gentle melodies. It is the sound of three immensely talented musicians, the powerhouse drummer Michael, Giles, his brother and bassist Peter Giles, and a quiet, bespectacled guitarist named Robert Fripp, searching for a voice and coming up with something closer to the Bonzo Dog Doo-Dah Band than a harbinger of sonic revolution. The album, a commercial dead end, is often treated as a curious footnote, but it is not a footnote. It is the chrysalis. It is the essential, seemingly contradictory cocoon from which the beast would emerge. Within its gentle absurdity lay the seeds of extraordinary musicianship. Michael Giles's drumming, even on these twee tracks, is a marvel of precision and invention. Fripp's guitar work, though restrained, shows a harmonic sophistication far beyond the rock norms of the day. They were missing ingredients, a catalyst, to transmute their talent into something elemental. The first catalyst arrived in the form of Ian MacDonald. A multi-instrumentalist who had spent time in a British Army band, MacDonald was a musician of rare breadth. He brought not only the saxophone and flute that would become iconic Crimson textures, but also a profound melodic romanticism. He was the counterbalance to Fripp's cerebral, angular thinking discipline. Where Fripp was the architect of complex, jagged structures, MacDonald was the artist who filled them with sweeping, melancholic color. He also brought with him a lyricist, a friend who didn't play a single instrument, but whose imagination would prove as crucial as any note played. This was Peter Sinfield. Sinfield was the band's resident mythmaker, their alchemist of words. In an era of peace and love platitudes, he was writing of neurosurgeons screaming for more. Of the fate of all mankind I see is in the hands of fools. He was not a songwriter in the traditional sense. He was a poet of the esoteric and the apocalyptic, drawing on mythology, astrology, and a deeply cynical view of the modern world. He became King Crimson's fifth member, a non-performing but utterly integral force who would shape their conceptual identity, design their lighting, and pen the words that gave their sonic fury its terrifying intellect. The lineup was almost complete. Peter Giles, whose bass playing was perfectly suited to the earlier, gentler incarnation, departed, sensing the seismic shift in direction. The search for a new bassist who could also sing led them through an ad in the Melody Maker to a young man from Dorset with a voice of impossible power and purity, Greg Lake. Lake was the final crucial piece. He possessed a commanding stage presence and a voice that was both imperious and beautiful, capable of delivering Sinfield's darkest prophecies with the authority of a herald. And so, in a cramped room in the basement of the Fulham Palace Cafe, the five-man entity of King Crimson was born. The stories from this period paint a picture not of a rock band jamming, but of a scientific research unit or a monastic order. Robert Fripp, even then, was instilling a philosophy he would later call discipline. Rehearsals were intense, focused, and demanding. The mission was not to write songs, but to create a new musical language. It was a volatile fusion of personalities. Fripp, the intellectual strategist, MacDonald, the romantic heart, Giles, the explosive rhythmic engine, Lake, the powerful vessel, and Sinfield, the visionary conceptualist. They were a self-contained ecosystem, a perfect and perhaps dangerously unstable chemical compound. The name itself, coined by Sinfield, was a synonym for Beelzebub, a conscious rejection of the fading flower power dream. They knew from the very beginning that they were creating something monstrous. The first true test of this monster came on July 5, 1969. The Rolling Stones were headlining a free concert in London's Hyde Park, a memorial to their recently deceased founder, Brian Jones. 500,000 people gathered, expecting a day of familiar blues rock. King Crimson was on the bill, a complete unknown. They walked on stage in the afternoon sun and, without a word, launched into 21st century schizoid man. We must pause here and try to imagine this moment. Imagine an audience basking in the gentle vibes of the late 60s, suddenly hit by a sonic blitzkrieg. The dissonant interlocking riffs of Fripp and MacDonald, Giles's frantic polyrhythmic drumming that seemed to tear time itself apart, Lake's voice, distorted in screaming Sinfield's terrifying vision of technological paranoia and political corruption. It was not rock and roll. It was something else entirely. It was the sound of the future arriving, uninvited and utterly overwhelming. Eyewitness accounts from that day speak of a stunned silence falling over the massive crowd, a collective intake of breath, followed by a roar of disbelief and ecstatic applause. In a single performance, King Crimson had gone from total obscurity to being the most talked-about band in Britain. Jimi Hendrix, present that day, reportedly called them the best band in the world. The challenge had been met. They had unleashed the beast, and the world, shockingly, was ready for it. But this sudden, blinding success would become its own form of pressure, a crucible that would test the very fabric of the band. This is a good moment to pause our journey. If the story of this impossible genesis is resonating with you, please remember to support Prog by hitting that like button and subscribing. It's a simple click for you, but it allows us to continue excavating these vital parts of our shared musical heritage. Now back to the court. The triumph of Hyde Park led directly to the recording of their debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King. The sessions at Wessex Sound Studios were, like their rehearsals, a model of intense focus. A little-known fact is that they initially began work with Tony Clark, the celebrated producer for the Moody Blues, a band whose use of the mellotron had paved the way for Crimson's own orchestral ambitions. However, the partnership was short-lived. Clark's approach, aimed at creating a lush, polished sound, clashed with the band's desire to capture their raw, live energy. In a move of staggering confidence for a new band, they parted ways with the star producer and decided to produce the album themselves. This decision was pivotal. It ensured that the final record would be an uncompromised, unfiltered document of their vision. The album cover itself, a frantic, screaming face painted by a computer programmer named Barry Godber, who tragically died shortly after its completion, was a perfect visual representation of the sonic assault within. Everyone knows the iconic tracks. 21st Century Schizoid Man became the anthem for a new, more anxious age. The title track, with its majestic, dread-filled mellotron choirs, was a work of staggering Gothic beauty. But the untold story of the album lies in its deeper cuts and the tensions they reveal. Epitaph, a funereal ballad of immense power, is perhaps the album's true emotional core. Here, Greg Lake's voice is at its most magnificent, delivering Sinfield's bleak prophecy, "Confusion will be my epitaph," with a sorrow that feels both ancient and chillingly prescient. It's the Sound of the 60s Dream Dying, a eulogy for a lost innocence. And then there is Moonchild. The first part of the song is a delicate, ethereal ballad, but it's the second part, a lengthy, free-form improvisation titled The Dream and the Illusion, that holds a key to the band's future dissolution. This section was a point of deep contention. For Fripp, it was a vital exploration of spontaneous composition, a core tenet of the band's philosophy. For others, particularly Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles, it was indulgent and unstructured, a departure from the tightly composed power of their other work. Listen closely to Moonchild, and you are hearing the first cracks appear in the foundation. You are hearing a fundamental disagreement about what King Crimson should be, a disciplined unit playing complex compositions, or a vehicle for unrestrained, in-the-moment creativity. This schism between the romantic, song-oriented vision of MacDonald and the abstract, systems-oriented vision of Fripp created a point of suspense that hung over their subsequent success. They had created a masterpiece, but could the creators survive their own creation? The very forces that made them brilliant were also pulling them apart. The album was released in October 1969 to stunning critical acclaim. Pete Townshend of The Who famously called it an uncanny masterpiece. It was a commercial success on both sides of the Atlantic. The logical next step was to conquer America. They embarked on a tour of the United States, sharing bills with acts like Fleetwood Mac, the Band, and Iron Butterfly. But the reality of the American rock circuit in 1969 was a brutal, soul-crushing grind. The intense, almost spiritual focus of the Fulham Palace Cafe basement could not be replicated in a different city every night, dealing with poor sound systems, indifferent audiences, and the sheer exhaustion of life on the road. The delicate, alchemical balance of the five members began to break down under the strain. The internal tensions, first hinted at during the Moonchild debate, erupted. Ian MacDonald and Michael Giles, the melodic and rhythmic heart of the band, were fundamentally not built for the rock and roll lifestyle. They were musicians who craved stability, creative comfort, and a less punishing environment. The relentless touring was anathema to them. The story goes that on a flight between gigs, the two made the devastating decision to leave the band they had been so instrumental in creating. For Robert Fripp, this was not just a lineup change, it was a betrayal of the highest order. He saw King Crimson as more than a band. It was an idea, a way of working, a vehicle for something far more significant than hit records or fame. In his view, MacDonald and Giles were abandoning a sacred mission for personal comfort. In their view, they were simply trying to preserve their sanity and their love of music, which the Crimson Machine was threatening to devour. They played their final show together at the Fillmore West in San Francisco in December 1969. Greg Lake, sensing the collapse, had also been approached by Keith Emerson to form a new group, which would soon become the supergroup Emerson, Lake and Palmer. The perfect, impossible organism of the first King Crimson had lasted less than a year. It had formed, created a work of enduring, genre-defining genius, and then completely disintegrated. Robert Fripp was left alone with the name and the concept. A king in a court with no courtiers. He reportedly offered to leave himself and let the others continue, but they declined. The responsibility and the burden of King Crimson fell upon his shoulders. And so, the untold story of King Crimson in 1969 is not one of triumph but of tragedy. It's the story of a perfect storm of talent and vision that was, by its very nature, unsustainable. It is a testament to the fact that true art is often born from immense friction, and that the fire required to forge something so new and powerful can just as easily consume its creators. The album they left behind, In the Court of the Crimson King, is not just a prog rock milestone. It is a monument. It is a sonic photograph of five individuals achieving a brief, perfect, and unrepeatable synergy. The subsequent history of King Crimson, with its ever-shifting lineups and constant evolution, is the story of Robert Fripp's relentless, lifelong quest to recapture, or perhaps redefine, the lightning that was caught in a bottle during that impossible year. The band didn't just break up, it exploded, sending shockwaves through the musical world that are still being felt today, and leaving behind a single, flawless artifact as evidence of its cataclysmic birth. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden history of a true musical titan. The story, of course, does not end here. If you are hungry for more explorations into the esoteric, the groundbreaking, and the profoundly human stories behind the music that changed the world, then make sure you are subscribed to Prog. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey. Please browse our library of other videos and continue to question, to listen, and to explore. The music deserves it, and so do you.